you. Okay, so we've started the Christmas season. That was last week with a talk that I was calling Christmas for the Unorthodox. And we were looking at the beginning of the nativity story from the Gospel of Luke. And the conclusion that we reached is that that particular story carries a message that is radical, subversive, and unorthodox. Because what we're seeing in that story is the beginning of a process where the social order of that day was being upended and literally turned around. It's a patriarchal society. It's dominated by men. Men have all the good jobs, all the roles of power and authority. Women are relegated to a very subservient status. And yet in that society we have this story which takes Mary, an unwed teenage mother, and casts her as the hero, the role model in the story. What happened to Mary could have made her into a social outcast, and yet the story calls her, and I quote, "blessed among women." That's amazing. The angel who appears to Mary is telling her, don't worry about appearances. As bad as this appears, you are blessed among women. There was this revolution that was on the horizon, and it is and was a revolution of values. Mary was going to be instrumental in bringing that about. She was voicing some of the first ideas that were going to be a main part of this revolution that was to come. So, when we left off last week, Mary was on her way to visit her cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth was in her elder years, probably in her 80s, and she was pregnant. She was going to be the mother of John the Baptist. And once again, okay, we've got to set this against the patriarchal culture again. We have two women who are being given all of the lines in the story. There they are together, and they're the centerpiece of the story. In fact, and this is something that just occurred to me the other day as I was preparing, Elizabeth's husband was a guy named Zechariah, okay? Not only do Elizabeth and Mary have all the lines, but in the beginning of this story, Zechariah is literally silenced. His voice is taken away at the beginning of the story. So, there's some really interesting symbolism going on here, and it's kind of fun to play with these stories because you begin to see these things, and it seems like it was deliberately set up. The male voice is silenced, the two women get the big story. And so Mary's visit to Elizabeth sets the stage for one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible. In Luke, it's called the Song of Mary. You may have known it as the Magnificat. I'll tell you, it's still burned into my memory from all of those years that I was attending the Catholic seminary. Magnificat anima mea Dominum et exaltavit spiritus meus in Deo Salvatori meo. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. When I call it one of the most famous passages in the Bible, I'm not exaggerating, because for those of you who enjoy classical music, the Magnificat has been set to music by Bach, Mozart, Bruckner, Rachmaninoff, and a whole bunch of other contemporary composers. It's a popular source of inspiration for artists everywhere. But it takes a few verses until we get into the prayer where we begin to see that revolutionary and subversive message coming forth again. We find another reference to Mary being an unlikely hero. She says this at the very beginning. She says, "For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant." She knows that she's perched on the bottom rung of the socio-economic ladder of the day, and she's not going to let that stop her. She goes on to say this. She says, "He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Okay, so this does not bode well for the 1% in Israel back in those days. And the interesting thing is that you don't have to believe that the events in this story literally happened or that they're literally true. You can if you want to. But the important fact is that this story was actually written down, composed, and circulated with the message that we see right there. And it was done in order to bolster and augment the things that Jesus was going to say later on in the Gospels. These words from the Magnificat were actually written down and shared over 2,000 years ago. And people wonder sometimes why these stories caught on the way that they did. Why are we still talking about this today? Yeah. Well, it's because of messages like this. People would read this. Well, they wouldn't read it back then. They had no way of, writing written stories weren't circulated back then. It was all done orally. People would tell these stories to each other, and they would carry on that way. Messages like this would give hope to those who were trapped in a social structure that was designed to concentrate wealth and power at the top and didn't offer much of anything in the way of opportunities for people on the bottom like Mary and other folks like her. Through Mary, this author is telling the world that all of that is about to change. The social order is going to be changed. The old values are going to be replaced by a new set of values. The old values, all about conformity, authority, power that's based on your wealth, your social standing. New values based on equality, compassion, service, generosity, love, forgiveness. That's what's coming. Two women in a male-dominated culture are delivering that good news. Imagine that. And there's more. Elizabeth gives birth. They bring the child, as was the custom, to the male religious authorities to be circumcised. And the religious authorities automatically assume that the boy is going to be named after his father. So they're getting ready to proclaim Zechariah. Or at the very least, this child should have been named after a prominent member of the family. Well, when they would ask what name the boy was to be given, it's Elizabeth who speaks up and says his name will be John. They argue with her. They give her a hard time. They say, well, how dare you choose the child's name, you silly woman? Don't you know that there are no other relatives in this entire family by the name of John? So they ignore her and they go to the father, Zechariah. They say, forget about her. We're gonna get the name from the father like it should be, right? And the father, who can't speak, makes a big show of writing down in big letters, his name is John. Gets his voice back in that moment too in the story. Isn't that interesting? What is the world coming to when a man agrees with his wife in matters like this? What is the world coming to when a woman gets to name her child, and not only does her husband not put her in her place, he agrees with her? What an affront to the traditional values. What an attack on our traditional institutions and blah blah and harumph, you know what I'm saying? It's the same kind of stuff that we hear reactionaries saying still today in the face of new ideas and changes in our value system. It was going on then, it goes on now. So, a revolutionary message coming from the feminine perspective. That's the story in Luke. But maybe you've been wondering if there is perhaps a masculine side to all of this. And there is, but we have to turn to the Christmas story in Matthew in order to find that. And it's interesting because when you put Luke and Matthew side by side, you get two very different stories, and yet they form this yin and yang, right? the masculine and the feminine, or opposites coming forward in unity to communicate a greater whole. These two complementary perspectives. So, Mary is the star in Luke. Joseph is the star in the Gospel of Matthew. Everything is communicated through Joseph, but Joseph doesn't say a word. He has no lines in the Gospel of Matthew. He doesn't speak. And when it comes to a description of Joseph, we get two words: carpenter and righteous. That's all we know about him. Carpenter and righteous. So the story of Joseph kind of unfolds like what we were doing here Friday night, a silent movie. It's like a silent movie. There are no lines, but we have to be able to fill in the details from the action that we see on the screen, and that's kind of fun. Joseph is a man of action. He's a powerful character in the story, even without lines that are spoken. And what the story is telling us is that Mary's part in the story is augmented and helped and completed and made whole with this other side of the story. The first action that Joseph takes in this story tells us everything about his character. He finds out Mary's pregnant. He's not the father. His first reaction is to keep it quiet. Oh, he's going to dump her, all right, but he's going to do it quietly so as not to expose her to public disgrace, perhaps a little stoning. I don't know what kind of things they did back then. But the story tells us that Joseph gets visited by an angel in a dream who encourages Joseph to accept both Mary and the child. Joseph changes his mind. Now, he didn't have to, because for all appearances, Mary was unfaithful. For all appearances. And of course, a manly man doesn't put up with infidelity, right? They could have written a country song about it, by the way. Poor old Joseph, his gal done him wrong, dog ran away, pickup truck won't start, brother's in prison, mama's in the hospital, and daddy gets drunk all the time. The only thing missing is something about a train, then you'd have the perfect country song. But something persuaded Joseph to put aside his hurt feelings, put aside any sense of self-righteous indignation that he might have had, and go ahead with the marriage. I think Joseph realized that no matter who the father was, nobody was going to step up to support Mary and protect the child, who were going to be left in a very vulnerable position in that culture. Maybe Joseph realized that this bond of love and friendship that he had with Mary was more powerful and important than all the other stuff that he'd have to put up with. So we see another transcendent idea, another transcendent value being put into action. Unconditional love. I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to do it. Later on in the teachings of Jesus, unconditional love. It's a core value. Ever wonder where Jesus got that from? It's interesting. Joseph was a revolutionary male role model. So, Joseph follows his guidance, even though he knows that his actions might cost him in the eyes of the people around him. And that's not easy. How many of us have ever been self-conscious or not willing to do something or say something that's important because we were concerned about what other people might think? It happens. We've all been there. It's not easy. So the story continues. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. The wise men come to visit. They leave their gifts. And Joseph has another dream that warns him that King Herod's soldiers are coming to kill the child. And they'd probably kill Mary and Joseph if they stood in the way as well. Now, imagine if something like this were happening in our contemporary culture. Let's say in our Hollywood movie culture, for example. Joseph is facing a threat, right? What would happen in a Hollywood movie? Joseph would go all Rambo, wouldn't he? He'd get armed to the teeth. Or better yet, because the wise men gave him all that gold and stuff. He had enough gold. He could have hired the Magnificent Seven, or perhaps the Magnificent Seven plus the Dirty Dozen and Dirty Harry to protect the family. That's the kind of thing we get out of our contemporary culture. The male role models of Hollywood culture tells us that violence is always the solution. Got a problem? Get a gun. No problem, right? So imagine if Joseph followed the example of Dirty Harry. Huh? Go ahead, Herod, make my day. Wouldn't have been the same story. It just would not have worked. Okay, so what does Joseph actually do in the face of this threat? He sneaks out in the middle of the night. He cuts and runs. Not the kind of thing you expect a macho man to do, but it's exactly the kind of thing you expect a smart man to do. A wise man, get out of Dodge, cowboy. Don't force a fight when you don't have to. A different set of values. Joseph does the right thing, even if it means that some people might consider him to be a coward, less than manly, whatever. He follows his guidance. He takes the family to Egypt where they're going to be safe. And the message here is that the world can be a very dangerous place for new ideas. Everything that Jesus grew up to stand for was a threat to the power structures. They eventually killed him for that, but not before those ideas took hold and ultimately swept the world. So you don't have to take these stories literally to see how powerful they were and still are. And even though in Unity we don't take them literally, I hope you can see that we do take them seriously. They continue to tell us things about human nature, about the evolution of human consciousness that are valuable today. The Christmas stories are a call to action. They show us that bringing a higher order of values into existence in the world requires the qualities that are embodied by Mary and Joseph. Mary demonstrates courage, intuition. Joseph shows us that loyalty and trust should be the foundation for all of our relationships, and that it's more important to do the right thing than to keep up appearances. So, there's more to these stories, and we're going to pick up with them again next week. Thank you.